get started by giving you all the details on this report that has come from Anti-Corruption Watchdog Association of Democratic Reforms that says 75% of newly inducted Maharashtra ministers have declared criminal cases. According to the Association for Democratic Reforms, 15 ministers have criminal cases against them. 13 of them are serious cases. Recently, 18 ministers were inducted in the state cabinet. All ministers, in fact, are reportedly crore-patis as per the declarations made by them to the Election Commission, and the average value of their assets is 47.45 crores. So that's the kind of information that we have accessed from the ADR report. Let's listen in.
The MLAs and MPs in our country, I think over 40% of them have got criminal cases against them. Incidentally, Maharashtra, if you take the overall MLAs thing, it is one of the highest number of MLAs with criminal cases. So political parties always make the allegation that, these are all false cases foisted upon us when the opposition was in power and all that. But the fact is that there are some very serious cases against them. Every 5 years when the elections are held, whether they are assembly elections or the general elections, we are seeing a jump of 4 to 5% increase in the number of people with criminal cases who are being elected.
My colleague Shweta joins us live. Shweta, these are again startling figures that we are looking at to say that all of the ministers inducted in the Maharashtra cabinet are crore-patis with close to 50 crore rupees in assets on an average. Not just that, the criminal cases. Now, in a way, people will connect the two and say, okay, there is very high possibility that these are all corruption cases and it is ill-gotten wealth.
Well, unfortunately, this is the sad state of the state of Maharashtra, where we are seeing 75%. That constitutes to 15 ministers. They are with the criminal record with them. And here there are 65%, which states that 13 ministers, they have serious criminal records against them. And two important things here to note down. Firstly, to understand that this report, in fact, this data has been furnished by the ADR, that's Association for Democratic Reform, also Maharashtra Election Watchdog. Now, this data was analyzed by them. And secondly, this data was collected by the ministers where they were producing self-sworn affidavits for 2019 elections. Now, keeping these data in mind, well, recently on August 9, when Maharashtra cabinet expansion took place, there are 18 ministers, those who have sworn in as ministers in the state of Maharashtra. That's 9 from BJP and 9 from Shinde-led Shiv Sena. Here, that total makes to 20, including CM and Deputy CM. Out of these 20, 75%. That is really shocking case where we are seeing 75% of the ministers have criminal record against them. And out of that, 13 ministers, that constitutes to 65% of the ministers have serious offences, that's non-bailable offences against them. And very startling is to see their financial background as well, where we are noting that here at an average there is 47 crores, 45 lakhs is the average total asset what we are understanding of these 20 ministers, and that's 100%. That's 20 on 20, all the ministers from hierarchy, from top to bottom or bottom to top, all these ministers are crore-patis.
Right.
Now, if we speak about who holds the highest assets, he is Mangal Prabhat Lodha with more than 400 crore of net value. Well, the lowest is with Sandipanrao with around 2.92 crore. Here, it is also very important to see that after the expansion, this is the first phase of induction. The second phase is still remaining. There is not even a single woman in the Maharashtra cabinet, and the startling figure states that more than 50% of these ministers are somewhere or the other included in the criminal offences. Here the question arises,
yes, Shweta,
how
these
will
are
the people
important
of
questions we are raising, and here on the channel we have been
conditions?
consistently questioning and exposing the kind of figures that have come from authentic sources on how is it that you have a scenario with high net worth, each one of them high net worth individuals making it to the ministry. Whether that has got anything to do with the cases against them, that connection not established. But yes, we will continue to bring to our viewers inputs as they come in on this. Thanks for joining us, Shweta, with the latest. Karnataka Chief Minister Basavaraj Bommai has said that they would empower the Lokayukta and would abolish the Anti-Corruption Bureau as per the BJP manifesto. After the cabinet meeting, CM Bommai has said that they would abide by the manifesto and empower Lokayukta but need guidance to implement it. This after Karnataka High Court had abolished the formation of a separate Anti-Corruption Bureau and shifted the graft cases pending before the ACB to the Lokayukta. Leader of opposition in Karnataka, Siddaramaiah, has said that ACB exists in many states, including Gujarat, but they respect the court's decision.
Anti-Corruption Bureau is existing in so many states, not only in Karnataka. In Gujarat also, there is an Anti-Corruption Bureau. In Tamil Nadu also, in some other forum, there is an Anti-Corruption Bureau. In Karnataka also, why see the circumstances were different when it was constituted. Now, the High Court has taken a decision that abolishing the government order. I welcome it.
Let me go across to Neha Hebbale joining us live. Neha, Mr. Siddaramaiah, of course, argues that there's nothing wrong in having an ACB like other states do. But now it's pretty clear that the government would be bound by the Karnataka High Court's order that there should be a shifting of all cases to the Lokayukta, and the whole idea of Anti-Corruption Bureau operating under the state government should be abolished.
Well, that's right, Afrida. And, this is something that all the governments have been talking about for quite some time now. In the year 2016, when the Congress-led Siddaramaiah government, in fact, had brought in the Anti-Corruption Bureau itself, there was quite a bit of, do and try at the time by the JDS and the BJP. However, there was no actual, concern raised thereon after. And today, you have the Chief Minister Basavaraj Bommai, who's gone on to state on record that this is what the BJP had promised in their manifesto. However, questions are now being raised about why nothing was done for the past 3 years by the BJP government over here, 2 years of the Yadurappa government, 1 year of the Bhumare government, and there was no action against really abolishing the Anti-Corruption Bureau. Now, Afrida, to put this in perspective, we've all known how powerful the Lokayukta is as a body and the kind of powers that it has now vested. Let's just give you one example of the year 2011, where we saw the Chief Minister, C.S. Yadurappa, back then had to step down just after one Lokayukta report against him. So now that the issue, of course, has been brought to light to the High Court, and they have abolished the Anti-Corruption Bureau, and more powers are being vested with the Lokayukta. We'll have to wait and see whether this solves the problem of corruption that the current government faces, because the Karnataka High Court did note two very key points. One being the fact that the conviction rate of the Anti-Corruption Bureau was very little, and second being the fact that no major cases had been filed against any of the senior elected representatives, be it MLAs, ministers or MPs, and which is why it is important today for the Lokayukta to be empowered. And we'll have to wait and see, with just a couple of months now left before the election, what kind of empowerment is actually given to the Lokayukta. The Chief Minister there, also not really shying away from saying that they are going to be facing right now, a challenge of the implementation. So that's something that we'll have to wait and see on ground. But this is something, that has been welcomed.
Remains to be seen. But at least the Chief Minister says he agrees with the Karnataka High Court that the Lokayukta needs to be empowered. Neha Hebbale, thanks for the details. Now, a major setback to the Karnataka government in a way, and staying with this story, we have more inputs coming in where, as I mentioned, the High Court has set aside the constitution of a separate anti-corruption bureau under the direct control of the CM and shifted the graft cases pending before the ACB to the Lokayukta. Former Lokayukta of Karnataka, Santosh Hegde, spoke to Times Network's Deepak Bopanna. Let's listen into what he has to say.
If you say a historic decision by the Karnataka High Court to abolish the Anti-Corruption Bureau and, to reinstate the powers of the Lokayukta, you've had a major role to play on, how the Lokayukta is perceived. How do you look at this judgment?
It's a wonderful judgment. I would call it people-friendly. Not that every judgment should be people-friendly. It should be in accordance with law. This is also in accordance with law. At the same time, this was the demand of the people also of Karnataka, probably even outside Karnataka also, where the corruption has gone to such a level. And unless it is investigated by an independent body, I don't think you can find a relief from that menace, which is very prevalent today and all. In that background, when neither the politicians nor the bureaucrats want to change to better, because this institution or the institution which is fighting corruption fights only against them. It doesn't fight against the ordinary citizens or anything. They certainly don't want a strong investigating agency, whatever the agency is and all. So they create, in spite of the fact Lokayuktha had done a wonderful job from 2001 to 2011, at least during that period they had done a wonderful job. They realized what could be the consequences of empowering Lokayuktha.
So how big do you think the win is this for the people? Because you mentioned that, considering the fact that this current government as well made promises earlier, that they would restore the powers of the Lokayuktha, that didn't happen.
All those promises were frauds. I'll tell you why. I'm not shooting from my shoulder. Just see this and all. In 2011, Lokayuktha submitted a mining report in which, among other officers, 3 chief ministers named, one from the Congress, one from the BJP, one from the JDS.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, that report for 1 year, this 2012 report was not implemented by the government of Karnataka. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, at that point of time, Congress was in the opposition when BJP was the ruling party.
Yeah.
Now, Congress went on a protest march from Bangalore to Ballari to insist upon implementation of the Lokayuktha report on mining. Okay?
Yes.
But the BJP government didn't do it. Next election, BJP lost the election, Congress came to power and Siddaramaiah became the chief minister.
Yeah.
They didn't implement it either.
Yeah.
After making a public demand that the Lokayuktha report should be implemented, they themselves didn't implement it.
Yeah.
Per contra, with a view to neutralize the Lokayuktha institution, they took away the power of anti-corruption and created ACB and gave it to the ACB, which is a police organization. And all.
Yeah.
Now everybody knows police works under the Home Minister.
Yeah.
When you are in the opposition, you shout at the rooftop.
Yeah.
When you come to power, quite contrary to the stand taken by you when you are in the opposition, you ignore the promise you made and all. Now, look at the BJP. In 2016, when ACB was constituted, the BJP was in the opposition. And then the opposition leader made a public statement, if we come to power, we will abolish ACB and give powers to this thing, abolish this thing. And give the extra power to Lokayuktha. That's what he said. They said at least now.
Yeah.
And they came to power in 2018 or so, and they've not done anything till now.
Yeah.
So it shows politicians are playing a game, which deliberately because of the fact that to protect themselves and all.
Right, let's now turn our focus to other updates, and this has been a raging debate on the issue of freebies, where every political party has made its position clear. The latest being the Congress party that has also waded into the debate after Union Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman accused Delhi CM Arvind Kejriwal of misleading people with a perverse definition of freebies. Today, AAP took centre stage once again to target the centre and accuse it of diverting public funds to aid rich businessmen and corporates. AAP questioned the logic behind reducing corporate taxes, and Congress, like I said, has also weighed in, saying there's a grey area between welfare measures and freebies, and urged people not to get trapped in the convoluted discourse. Earlier, a bench led by Chief Justice of India N.V. Ramanna asserted that a distinction between welfare measures and freebies must be drawn when taxpayers keep questioning governments over the lack of basic amenities such as good roads and electricity, even as freebies are doled out as poll promises. Stating that all freebies cannot be couched as welfare schemes, the Supreme Court on Thursday observed that some financial discipline must be maintained, and handouts as electoral promises is a serious issue. Also adding that the debate should be initiated to assess its impact on the economy of a state and taxpayers. Let's listen in to both sides of the argument.
पूरी की पूरी देश की गवर्नेंस में अब दो मॉडल सामने आए हैं। एक मॉडल है जिसमें सत्ता में बैठे लोग अपने दोस्तों को, अपने परिवार के लोगों को मदद पहुंचाते हैं, उनको हर तरह की मदद करते हैं, वो दोस्तवाद का मॉडल है। दूसरा मॉडल है कि जनता के टैक्स के पैसे का इस्तेमाल लोगों को अच्छे सरकारी स्कूल देने में किया जा रहा है, लोगों को अच्छे सरकारी हॉस्पिटल, वहाँ पे अच्छी दवाइयाँ, वहाँ पे उनके टेस्ट के लिए किया जा रहा है, उनको बिजली, सस्ती बिजली, मुफ्त बिजली देने के लिए किया जा रहा है।
अरे मुफ्त की रेवड़ी क्या है, मैं आपको बताना चाहता हूं एक एक करके। कुल मिलाकर 12,58,365 करोड़ रुपए का लोन राइट ऑफ किया गया है 2013-14 से। अगर आंकड़ा देखें तो ये बैंक फ्रॉड की लिस्ट है, ये भी आरबीआई का डाटा है। जितने बैंक घोटाले हुए जहां पे जनता का पैसा जमा था, ये बैंक घोटाले किए गए लगभग 5 लाख करोड़ रुपए के बैंक घोटाले। कॉर्पोरेट टैक्स मैंने बताया था कि 30% से घटा के 22% किया इन्होंने, यानी कि पूंजीपतियों का टैक्स घटा के 30% से 22% किया, और उसका घाटा कितना हुआ? 1,84,000 करोड़ रुपए का घाटा हुआ बजट को।
Both Aam Aadmi Party and BJP, their promises are jhoot ki gatri promises. We are categorically against the jhoot ki gatri culture. We are not against Manrega. In fact, Prime Minister made a fun of Manrega. But during pandemic, Manrega was the scheme which had helped the government. We are not against giving some small assistance to the poor people. But when everybody is talking about muft ki revdi, why we are not talking about 7.27 lakh crore rupees of loan written off in last 5 years by public sector banks? Why we are not discussing that in 2019, because of corporate rate tax cuts, every year the negative impact to the exchequer is 1.45 lakh crore. When we are going to discuss all these things, muft ki revdi kharab, as per Modi ji, बट मुफ्त की गजक आने दो और खाने दो।
अरविंद केजरीवाल जी के झूठे वादे और ये जो फ्रीबीज की कहानी अरविंद केजरीवाल जी कहते रहते हैं, उसके विषय में बताना आवश्यक है। बंधुगण, अरविंद केजरीवाल जी का एक ही मत है, एक ही उद्देश्य है, कैसे भी करके आम आदमी पार्टी और अरविंद केजरीवाल जी की प्राधान्यता स्थापित हो देश में, उनके एम्बिशंस फुलफिल हो, उनकी महत्वाकांक्षा आगे बढ़े। इसलिए झूठ दिन पर दिन किस प्रकार से वो परोस रहे हैं, ये हम देख रहे हैं।
This evening is Madhavan Narayanan, a senior journalist and economist, also Dilip Cherian, founder of Perfect Relations, Shilpi Jain, senior lawyer. Okay, introducing our panelists this evening, Madhavan Narayanan, senior journalist and economist. Joining us also is Dilip Cherian, founder, Perfect Relations, and Shilpi Jain, who's a senior lawyer. Very warm welcome to all three of you. Thanks for giving us time here on The Big Focus. I want to begin by asking you, Mr. Narayanan, that, you know, this is a debate that has been raging on for quite some time, but the problem is there seems to be a lot of ambiguity. And depending on which side of the political divide you are in, parties are using the term freebies often interchangeably with welfare schemes or loan waivers or write-offs. The Supreme Court has cautioned against this. The primary issue is welfare schemes for the benefit of the poor is necessary but allurements ahead of elections with the intention to garner votes is a malady. Where do you stand in this and how do you draw the line?
Afrida, apologies in advance if my audio is a little unclear because I've been having some issues. But let me first say that I don't like the word freebies at all. I think there's always something called social linguistics in which the elite sometimes change the vocabulary to make it appear as if something wrong is being done. I would prefer to use the word vote bees that I have coined. You know, if you're doing it in exchange for vote, it's not free, it's vote in the first place. Second thing is, what do you call an allurement? Do you think laptops for schoolgirls is an allurement? I can understand, let's say, you know, in Tamil Nadu, Mangal Sutras were given as electoral promises. Now, I regard the vote as a legitimate democratic instrument for transactions between the voters, the citizens, and the government. If anything is promised in the manifesto, it is explicitly allowed in the democratic process, and therefore it's wrong to call them freebies. You can argue sometimes on things like color TVs or maybe Mangal Sutra, but laptops, health, education, all this definitely do not count as freebies because they add to what I call the soft infrastructure of the country. The word infrastructure is being appropriated to mean only expressways and airports, which only benefit the rich. The poorer people want to have something they can clutch and hold on to. And we also have a history of welfare states in Scandinavia, in Europe, and all, which have progressively shown that the human development, as exhibited by the Human Development Index of the United Nations, is better served by welfare state mechanisms. So we could do with a public debate on what constitutes welfare spending, but having a morally unacceptable situation where lakhs of crores of loans are being waived off, and most important, banks are being recapitalized using funds without any accountability, and managements are being changed through public sector banks.
These are two extremes, isn't it, Mr. Narayanan? Because on one hand, you're saying that there are loan waivers to the tune of crores that benefit the rich, which is again an issue. But on the other hand, when you have these dole-outs, these handouts right ahead of elections, as we see happening now, Mr. Kejriwal has used the opportunity of making these announcements right ahead of Gujarat elections. There somewhere, perhaps, the Election Commission must come in and draw the line on when does it become an allurement. But there again, there is an issue when it's made an election manifesto as a promise, for instance, for free education or for free power or electricity. That apparently doesn't qualify to be called a freebie. So there is some sort of an ambiguity. Shilpi Jain.
But how about a gimmick? You know, if there is a Balakot airstrike just before the elections, and that is being used in the election campaign, that's also some sort of a gimmick. So I'm against
that's a gimmick. But here
kind.
We are talking about using money that is taxed from the citizen.
Everything
and there is going to be a difference of opinion here now on what is should be the priority when it comes to spending that money. Should the government be using it for welfare schemes? But then when that becomes an allurement for garnering votes, it becomes an issue. Shilpi Jain?
The very fact that the Supreme Court has agreed to look into this, I think it's very progressive and it is need of the hour. As citizens and as taxpayers, we are concerned how our money is used by the government. And there has to be a check on arbitrary or mindless use of the money that they collect. And we see various examples of this mindless use, and we are mute spectators. On a particular evening, you will see millions of rupees being spent on lighting up diyas before a mandir. I mean, for heaven's sake, I mean, is this publicity? Is this doing politics in the name of religion? We can do without it and rather, use that money for providing food to the poor. Now, in terms of healthcare, we are way behind the developed countries. In terms of education, we are way behind. You have a right to education, but it remains on paper. You know the state of government schools. If it was really good, I think we would not have as many private schools and the rich going to the private schools. So are the government schools at par with the private schools? They are not. Are the teachers being paid? Do the same talented teachers come to the government schools as in private schools? No, they don't. What is the condition in the government hospitals? It's appalling. So we have to, you see, I think the court and the judiciary is meant to check executive excesses, and they are meant to put the government actions in line and see where the government excesses are there. So it's very much needed that, particularly the poll promises, I think that has to be banned 6 months before the elections. If you have to do something, you do it during the 5-year tenure that you have. This has to be banned. Any kind of...
So the timing you are saying is important. When and how and for what purpose it is directed, a particular scheme that a government might say is directed to the poor. But the timing there again becomes critical. What the Supreme Court has done is it's tread very cautiously on the matter. And that itself shows that there's a fine line because it talks about maintaining the balance. The matter is left to interpretation. Dilip Cherian, the Prime Minister argues that you are burdening the taxpayer if you are announcing these free schemes. On the other hand, the argument is that, for the poor to have free electricity, to have free education is something that at least the AAP argues is dispensing their constitutional right.
No, Frida, the basic thing is, there are 3 points really. One, does the Supreme Court have the expertise to be able to distinguish between benefits, freebies, what constitutes social infrastructure as they've expressed. Shruti is right in saying that the court has drawn attention to it, but I only hope that the court assembles the right kind of minds to analyze this, because this is serious welfare economics stuff and it needs experts. That's one. The second is that I think I agree that Madhavan's point about the linguistics of it is what is creating problems. Your freebie is my welfare scheme and my freebie is your welfare scheme. But the easiest test of it is to see who is the beneficiary and what are the numbers involved. For example, you might argue that by salvaging a group which is at the edge of bankruptcy, you are saving 70,000 jobs as an excessive number. Okay? Now, if you want to benefit 70,000 people and give them jobs, what does it cost under Manrega? And where would the benefit actually lie to the exchequer and the budget? That's the second point. The third point is, as you said, that we need to recognize that there ought to be a silence period as far as these announcements are concerned. And along with the silence period, there ought to be an implementation period for anything that is announced after the elections. So if you, for example, promise that I'm going to give you 1 lakh jobs a day or 10 lakh jobs a month, then I think the court needs to also have a means of monitoring that, because that is a welfare scheme which is announced, but actually just tends to be a freebie as far as electoral promises are concerned. So these are my 3 anxieties. And from an image point of view, from looking at it from a country point of view, the image of India will suffer if we choke off what the poor need. The image of India...
Please, Mr. Cherian, across parties, political parties have resorted to announcing SOPs ahead of elections. This is nothing new. The Apex Court has said that there is a need to distinguish between welfare schemes from freebies because the economy gets impacted. And we are running in our graphics as well with the example of Punjab, for instance, how this is, is adding to the debt of a particular state. and therefore to resort to these kind of easy tactics to lure voters should not be there. But at the same time, there is a real point about being a welfare state, being a socialist state, which the AAP is consistently arguing around the fact that, you cannot simply, again, using the argument of how loans are waived off and how corporate tax is reduced, and also says that the electoral promises of free education or free power cannot be called a freebie. Where the top court is yet to come up with a clear opinion on this. But what I want to understand, Mr. Madhavan, is that the submissions that have been made by the BJP, in fact, this is a plea that is pending in court, which has been initiated by a BJP leader, talking about how neighboring countries have suffered because of this trend and political parties influence voters. That is because, see, you have Arvind Kejriwal now saying 2,000 rupees for all women above the age of 18. What is that according to you? Is that a freebie or not?
You ask me. I think it's important to understand that we are talking about something called a universal basic income. By most respected economists of the world are discussing that issue right now. And therefore, any cash payment that supports the needy, which could be students, which could be aged people, would legitimately count in some kind of safety net scheme, what's called social safety net, which is part of welfare economics. Or if it is to create assets that include health and education, that will also count as welfare economics. I would argue that if the timing is not correct, or if it loses fiscal prudence, we cannot blame, what is called fiscal imprudence and then link it to welfare spending. We can actually have taxation schemes or revenue mobilization schemes. We can have rationalized spending in which you might spend less, let's say less on an auditorium and more on a school. These are legitimate parts of any debate in a welfare society. What is being done very wickedly in the political discourse is to randomly marry a Sri Lankan economic crisis with a welfare spending and then blame it on freebies ahead of election. We have to approach it with a sense of detail, and my claim is that we should involve the academia and the civil society in this. We cannot, Niti Aayog is not the right organization. It's part of the ruling party establishment. This should be debated in parliament, in all legislatures, most certainly. But you should also, any expert panel on this should involve the civil society activists, transparency and anti-corruption activists, and welfare economists who have got a very good thing going in terms of established evidence on what improves the standard of living in society.
Yes, because what is happening here is that beneficiary politics is something that is being resorted to, like I said, across party lines. Shilpi Jain, what can the top court do? Because again, like I said, the Supreme Court has said that it is up to the legislature. Now, an expert panel is supposed to give its recommendations to the center. Do you think the onus is on the legislature, it's on the executive per se, and not so much the judiciary?
Policy issues. That's the job of the government, and they may give their suggestions, or the fact that they've looked into it and are considering it is a message and a strong signal that the government must go thus far and not further.
Okay.
But now what is required at present is there has to be some kind of a check in terms of how the government is using the money. Now that kind of a check will come only when people outside the government get involved in that. In every state, we have different governments, and whoever is the government, it has to be a non-government organization which has to be empowered to look into this in the distribution of the tax money they collect, in the distribution of indirect tax money they collect, and how they use it. Only then, because otherwise they are bound to link it with their political gain, and the moment they link it with their political gain, the welfare schemes or the actual beneficiary are
it's a very important point, and that's precisely what we wanted to bring out in this conversation, that, the definitions change the moment there is a quid pro quo, and the moment there is a transactional intent, that is when it becomes a problem. And like the lawyer in this case, in its petition, has said that it subverts democracy and democratic principles. We will have to wait and see